Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, and welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we go after shame anywhere we can get it and then squash it. That's what we do here. I am super excited for the topic tonight, like really super excited. So I'm going to get into that in a minute. But before I do, just a few updates. I wanted to remind people who might follow me about I am having a ethical non-monogamy group starting again on February 24th. I'm actually partnering with the Sanctuary Salt Lake City in order to host that. We have room for, I think, about 15 to 20 couples. Or singles, you don't have to be coupled to come. And it's a 7-week group, and you can join us either in person here in Salt Lake City or through Zoom. So if you don't live in the area, you can still attend. And that's a 7-week kind of good intro for folks who are maybe considering opening up their relationships or have opened up relationships but are wondering how to, deal with maybe some trouble spots that have come up along the way, etc. So super excited about that. Next Thursday night, I am teaching at the Sanctuary on the topic of jealousy, again, with the construct of ethical non-monogamy and how to manage those very normal, natural feelings that at times arise for people in open relationships of some sort or another. It's so interesting, though, that when I say, okay, yeah, this is for ethical non-monogamy, every time I teach, everybody always says, well, this is also applicable for monogamy, too. So it's just like these are concepts that can kind of go both ways. But anyway, those are the things that I have coming up. We also have a ketamine group that is coming up in March. So if you're interested in doing ketamine like in a group format for a variety of issues that you might want to be focusing on in your own individual life. We are also going to hopefully, I think our plan is to have like a group maybe every 2 or 3 months so people can come and process with others. And for some, it's a little less expensive to do it in group format than individual format and all those things. So we're trying to make some accessible options for folks. Okay, I think that's all I have on that. So today I have with me Tara Olson. She is an associate certified social worker, recently graduated from the University of Utah. She approaches therapy from a feminist, multicultural, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive framework, and views healing as a collaborative process. We brought her on to Symmetry as one of our interns about 2 years ago, I think. We loved her. She had to leave our internship because they only allow people to do 1 year in an internship. So second year, she had to go elsewhere. We were all like, so sad because we loved Tara. And now she's back at Symmetry Counseling as one of our associates. So I'm thrilled to have her back in general, but I'm even more thrilled because one of her areas where she has a lot of interest is eating disorder work. And within the intersection of religion, sexuality, mental health, oftentimes I have not seen anywhere near enough what I'd like to see, including also that intersection of how food and eating disorders and our relationships with, just bringing nutrition into our bodies affects all of this as well. So I'm just thrilled. I feel like with eating disorders, I swear I'll shut up in a minute and actually let you speak. But for the things that I've noticed in my career, substance abuse or substance dependence and eating disorders are very expertise, kind of niche things that in order to get good help, you need people who have been trained in those arenas. But what I have also seen is that people who are trained in those arenas and even treatment centers that focus on those arenas are not really looking at the intersection of sexuality nor religion. So to have somebody who's interested in all of it, I'm like, Tara, give me more of you. So with that as your intro, hi.
Hi. Hi, I'm so excited. I'm so excited to be joining you. And yes, this intersection is a passion of mine, and I am so curious to where you may take me in this conversation. But yes, I am really I not only am very passionate about this, but I do think that there is this intersection between eating disorders, sexual intimacy, and religious trauma. And I do see how this shows up in terms of not only clients that I'm working with, but just in general in the ways that I think even when there is an exodus from a high demand religion, there can be for anyone who is going through that process, who has a history of an eating disorder, how it can reemerge. And I just think that when we think about the context of religion and bodies, and one of the things that I'm really obsessed with is like bodies in therapy, who is showing up, how are they showing up, in what ways do we think of specific bodies as being worthy of therapy itself. And so as a woman of color, I am very interested in how eating disorders show up in my own culture and in my own communities, and how that's often denied in terms that we have a very skewed idea of who has an eating disorder. That's often the swag, as the acronym is the, skinny, white, affluent girl. But that's just certainly not the case. And so not only is it showing up in communities of color, it's also showing up in those who have chosen to leave a high demand religion, because that transition itself is so on its own traumatic. And so just if we turn it to an attachment lens and we think about God as an attachment figure, an eating disorder serves this role of pseudo-attachment figure, and so it is predictable in periods of uncertainty. It is very grounding. It can regulate in times of distress. It can offer a sense of agency and a sense of safety. And I often like to think of an eating disorder as an act of resistance. And so when a sense of boundaries and intense emotions are too difficult to convey or have been discouraged, or when one's boundaries have been continually violated or ignored, this is on its own a really unannounced, silent, but a boundary nonetheless. And that eating disorders are often tied to unmet attachment needs. And so it may be showing up when someone leaves the church. It may be showing up while they're in the church, and they're certainly showing up in their relationships. And so I do think that there's such a dearth of any sort of research here, because individuals do think of eating disorders as kind of classically in adolescence, you'll grow out of it. And that is not the case. And so individuals continue to grow and age and move into an eating disorder, or the eating disorder changes, and it's certainly going to be impacting our interpersonal relationships and our romantic relationships. And I don't think those things are often quite discussed, and how it actually impacts the partner without an eating disorder. So that's yeah.
Yeah. No, and I, even in my own training, like my training in sex therapy did not cover anything really in regards to eating disorders. My training as a marriage and family therapy just kind of brushed on it, and so it's so interesting that even though we go through all these big training programs, when we really want to start niching into helping certain populations, it really does require another level of training, which is why I'm so excited, because you're interested in the sex therapy tract and in the eating disorder tract. And so I'm just like, oh, that is like the type of provider that is just really needed in this kind of space. So are you, as much as you're comfortable, how much do you want to tell us about kind of your own personal background? Maybe share with folks how you come into understanding religion, spirituality, even your cultural background a little bit, and how that all informs your work, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Absolutely. So I am an anomaly at Symmetry Counseling in that I do not come from a high demand religious background. I was not enmeshed in the church. It does not mean that the impact of the church didn't impact my life nonetheless, be it being non-religious, non-Mormon, and being ostracized for that. And then I also think that, especially through sexual development, finding how the church really withholds or punishes the body, and that obviously will impact my relationships, being in that I'm with people whom can see me as a source of sin, as someone who is going to make them unworthy. And so I also experienced, I grew up moving around a lot throughout the West growing up. My family was squatters. So we didn't have a permanent residence until I was about the age of 10. And so my own experience through that was, a transient, very unstable, unpredictable type of life. And then being moved into the suburban West Jordan and encountering a lot of hostility, a lot of racial hostility, being that, I am from a family of color, and at the time my father was incarcerated. And so there was several layers of feeling on the outside, being that I wasn't Mormon, being that I'm a person of color, and that I also had a father who was seen as a criminal. And I also kind of see some of the liberation I had in not being so grounded and enmeshed in this church, in that I also came out to my family when I was 13 years old in response to the death of, and I was a couple years off from it, but from Matthew Shepard. It really impacted me to know that there was a young man who was tortured and left to die in the cold of Wyoming, and that the response from people around me was that this was almost something that was deserved. Coming out to my family was such a non-event. It was such a footnote. And yes, while that sounds incredibly dismissing, I also didn't encounter what I experienced with many individuals in the LGBTQ community here in Utah, which is that coming out was also a spiritual death. It's the removal from your internal family. It's something that comes with such loss of community, loss of familiar ties, and loss of also a sense of one's own spirituality. Am I worthy? Am I allowed to still have a relationship to God? Am I seen as someone who has been forsaken? And so I think I was allowed to really kind of bypass a lot of that, in part because my coming out was just, it was, as my mother said to me, "Oh, Tara, it's just another thing." And yet I didn't have to also bear the burden of, oh, she will no longer be my mother, or she will no longer love me. It didn't change much of my dynamic there. And so I do think it's given me a lot of, it has allowed me to have a lot of humility around, like, in the ways that I was spared additional trauma by not being so tethered to a religious doctrine that had more or less said, I'm a person who is not even a person. I am, a sin. I am unwanted. And so I think that was very impactful for me. Can
you speak more to that, as far as what do you mean by you were, as you're living and growing up in a community where there is a high demand religion that's the primary, cultural influence in your life, even though you're not a member yourself. are you saying that you're a sin because you were a person of color, or because you didn't have the same standards that maybe others and you were willing to sexually explore? And then if they're willing to do that with
Yeah,
you, then you're the problem, you're the
absolutely.
seductress per se,
Yeah.
or tell us more
Yeah.
about what you mean by that.
Well, one of the things is that even though I was out to my family, I wasn't out to my peers. It was too dangerous. It was too, I came out in, 1994, 96, excuse me, 96. It was too dangerous. And so myself as a lesbian, myself in my queer identity was very much, one that was a secret, at least in terms of friends at school didn't know. And I do think that going through the process of dating and experimenting sexually, I lived in a household where there was a lot of conversations around sex and very informal sex education, but I also got a lot of these conversations because my mother was a teenage mother, and so there was obviously a lot of conversation around having, if you're having sex, then please use protection. And I think it was very much to make sure my brother and I weren't going to be going down the path that she did, which was having a child at 16. But also bodies were talked about in my family, and pleasure was talked about in my family, and I also see the ways that that was not the norm for those my peers or for anyone who I was dating. And so there seemed to just always be an element of shame, their shame for, oh, we made out, I have to talk to my bishop. And so their shame would become my shame. And so there was an added layer of, yes, this seductress who is going to make me unworthy of my mission, was very much the experience I had. I even remember someone writing me right before they left on their mission to let me know that the things they did with me were bad, and that they had repented and they hoped that I would repent. And I remember receiving that with such confusion, because for me it was like, oh, I was just in my body with your body, and we were, and it was so in my mind so pedestrian. It was just like making out and fondling, and yet I'm receiving this letter of wow, we did this thing, and I've had to go through this long, arduous process of repenting and cleansing myself in order to be so worthy to be on a mission. And so in a lot of ways, I think that the messaging I would receive was, if I am to have desire with you and explore that desire, then it can lead to, the worst outcome ever, which is that I'm seen as unworthy. So yes, that's a little bit of how I was seen as a sin itself. And I also think that there can't, of course, be a conversation around also how race is influencing that too, which is that women of color are always kind of seen as the Jezebel, as seen in these ways that they have loose morals and they are loose sexually. And I also think this becomes complicated in that I did identify as a lesbian, but I also didn't have the language at the time for what and how I do identify myself, which is that I see myself as a pansexual person. But it didn't mean that, I liked my relationships with women, but I enjoyed sex and experimenting with boys and men. And that was, of course, its own complication for me personally, but it also did mean that I was pursuing desire all the time, especially as I was going through my adolescence and my hormones are all over the place. And I found that there was often ways that I was being kind of shamed for having my body, and also this concern around am I adhering to these specific stereotypes around what I represent as a woman of color, and that there is already laden in there. It's already impregnated with so many ideas around sexuality and lasciviousness just by default of being a woman of color.
Yeah. Wow. It's just fascinating to hear you talk from the perspective of a person living within a culture, even if they're not part of that culture, how deeply that still gets internalized. And I don't know that we always think about that. I think as people in a church or post church membership, you just think that these things only affect people within your community, and it's like, no, if you're even if you're not evangelical but you live in the Bible Belt, it's going to affect you, right? Even if you're not Southern Baptist but you live in the South, it's going to affect you. And if you're not Mormon and you live in the Rocky Mountain West, it's going to affect you. And it's so interesting how people are very comfortable imposing their own standards, beliefs, like even calling you to repentance, very comfortable with that when it's completely inappropriate boundaries and projection of their own belief systems onto others. But when folks believe that that's the truth and it's global, then they lack those boundaries. So that's really interesting. What brought you to the interest of eating disorders in particular? What's your history there?
So I mean, one is that I think it is my own awareness of eating disorders and disordered eating within my own family. And in part, this is because, while I did have a teenage mother and we were unhoused for many of my developmental years, my mother would model on the side. My mother was Miss Sandy. And so there was a lot of emphasis on beauty and beauty ideals and femininity. And I really had rage against this, especially I think like in my period of I'm only wearing my brother's hand-me-downs and I'm never going to wear a dress, and really denying femininity because everything I saw about it was a trap for what I saw from my mother, which is that it was a source of higher scrutiny, and there was always the male gaze, but then there's also this internal gaze. And so yes, I grew up with the mother who was chronically dieting, and I think that's something that is maybe not apparent to a lot of people, is that poverty itself is not only is it traumatic, but that when there's periods of deep food insecurity, it changes someone on an endocrine level. And I'm a growing body, and there's food today, but not food tomorrow. And so you're already inviting kind of a binge restriction cycle, and that changes you. It changes your entire bodily makeup. And I bring this up because my mother was, she was adopted from the Philippines. She was left in an orphanage until she was 10. And so a lot of her ways of also engaging with food and her relationship to food was very complicated, in that there was also, a historical, like intergenerational sort of, food insecurity. And so there was, so even when we would have food growing up, I would still see my mom, smoking cigarettes rather than fully eating dinner, or compensating, like a lot of compensatory behaviors of going to the gym to burn off, eating a tater tot. So there was, so much of that was also happening. But then I also grew up in the 90s, and that was the era of heroin chic, and it's the rise of Weight Watchers, phentermine, and so much of it was just inundating my and impacting me as I'm growing up. And I think what happened too is, like, being that I'm a person of color, but I'm also, biracial, it just was like part of me felt like I wanted so desperately to not always be this person on the outside. And I would experience at school such a sense of isolation for looking and appearing so differently than the other girls. And so there was this, this feeling in me of like, well, if I was just thin enough, if I was just thin, if I was just cute, if I was just these sorts of things. And in so many ways, being thin was in my mind equivalent to passing, to being white. And I don't think this is too different, because I also think a lot of our notions around bodies and fatness are deeply, deeply anti-racist. They're deeply rooted in ideas that, again, bodies of color are they're not bodies who are obedient, they're unruly, they're in need of control. And so I do think that we've also attached thinness to whiteness, and more exclusively, we've attached it to our ideas of femininity. And that itself is deeply rooted in, Western religion. If you're thinking around how there's this concept of, like, if we're thinking of religion itself, the very first sin of humanity is a woman eating a forbidden apple. And so this narrative frames women's appetites as inherently dangerous and disobedient and tied to lust and greed and sin, and it has to be controlled. And so throughout, Western religious, especially high demand religions, fasting is always used as this form of religious devotion. And so you can see how there's this women's bodies being used as vessels of religious expression, culturally sanctioned to be that, and that by fasting they're suffering and they're getting themselves closer to God. And extreme fasting and self-denial is a spiritual practice, and this goes all the way back to it's the fasting monks or the fasting girls. It would be like Saint Catherine. I think it's Saint Catherine of Siena. But yes, they fasting itself was seen as, and abstaining from food was always seen as achieving a closer union with God. And so I think that my interest in all of this and how I even got here was that, yeah, I'm impacted. I'm not in this religion, but I'm being impacted by it. And I'm part of this culture, Western culture, which is, of course, going to have its roots in Western Christianity and these ideas around bodies that are seen as divine and bodies that are seen as less than. And so I think for myself, I've always had a kind of struggle with having am I a body that's worthy of taking up space? Am I a body that's worthy of being? And I think that for me, I've come to the realization that there's no greater resistance to these systems that are really in their intent on keeping people small and keeping them controlled. There's no greater resistance and no radical act than eating and taking care of my body, because it's a body that's definitely not wanted. It's a body that's wanting to be, extinguished by these larger systems. And so I think that I come to that, and I think that I also can understand that how individuals who are really, 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 who grow up in these very religious, rigid religious upbringings and very strict Christian patriarchy, that it can really promote and reinforce and really cause trauma in the relationship they have with food and their body. And it really just kind of enforces an inability to listen and trust their body. And that disconnection to me is such a source of trauma. So when I think of an eating disorder, I see it always through the lens of it is a trauma response. And so I think I've kind of gone all over the place with you, Natasha, and your listeners, but this is kind of how I've arrived at my curiosity and my passion around this, is because I do think, moving it even forward is that, like, yeah, women's, a starved population is a population easy to control. And so if you look at this root of really controlling women's bodies, controlling their appetites, it's to control them. And you can see echoes of how, like, in acts of war, starving a population is always not necessarily about having that population die. It's to weaken them to the point that they can't fight back. And we can see this in the Holocaust. We can see this most recently in Gaza. So for me, I'm like, I really want to help people rebel against this. And I especially want to help women rebel against this. But I also see the ways that even when people choose to leave a high demand religion, sometimes they can replicate aspects of it through, I see it most prominently in diet culture, which pulls from religious morals and it just repackages it as wellness. And yet you're seeing language such as fasting, detoxing, purifying, good foods, bad foods. And I see how a lot of people can just kind of like thrust themselves into that because it's rules, and rules are what they're used to. And there's nothing that has more rules than an eating disorder. And so, yes, I think that this is how so many of these things start to show up. And I also just see it as a massive disconnect from the body, which is, and from desire and from pleasure and from the sense of aliveness. And that, I think, makes my heart break. And it also makes me even more like, all right, I want to guide you into a place to having a relationship to your body that's one that's where you get to trust its wisdom, and really feel safe and secure in your body.
Wow. Yeah, that was so, I loved everything you said. I knew we would be able to talk about this for 10 hours. We're not going to be able to do that, but I can see myself wanting to talk to you for 10 hours about this. So many things there. I guess, do you have, I don't expect you to have this off the top of your head, but if you have any kind of like generic statistics. I know that one of the things I remember hearing for a long time was Brigham Young University being kind of one of the highest numbers of like disordered eating out of the national universities, right? And I remember hearing this years ago, decades ago. I don't know if that's still currently the case, but with the and I don't know the numbers off my head, like what we're talking about, like 10% or 50% or whatever, but it makes sense from this idea of perfectionism, the great emphasis on image and being perfect and being, controlled, like you're saying. And so I just wondered if you had any kind of statistics that you could share with us, or is there any literature to show that folks from higher demand religions maybe struggle with this more or not? Maybe there isn't statistics around that.
Well, I don't have any statistics because there hasn't been a ton of research around religion and eating disorders. What we do know is that there is some literature that shows that eating disorder rates are higher in individuals who present with stronger extrinsic religious belief, meaning like I don't fully, I'm having this religion is feeling pushed on to me, and it's creating a backlash, and this is an attempt to gain agency. But I don't have exact numbers as to, and especially, yes, I think that we all kind of know that BYU, not only does it have like the highest rates for disordered eating, but it also has incredibly high rates for, plastic surgery. We're like the plastic surgery capital of the country. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with what we do know, which is that by and large, women remain very, very committed to religion, and men are often the ones who will drift away. And so for the LDS Church, a lot similarly to, we also see this pattern in the Orthodox Jewish community. There's a higher rate of women to men. And so there is a deep push for, at least the most recent statistics is that for every one Mormon man, bachelor, for every one of them, there's 7 eligible women. And so there's 7 to 1. So that's high competition. And so that, of course, is going to kind of, it can really start to emphasize that, like, I need to look a specific way in order to secure a husband, and I need my husband because it's the only way I can achieve, salvation. It's the only way that I can achieve my duties as to God. And so I think I'm not necessarily surprised, but I also think when you look at if we were to look at just like the LDS church culture itself, there is such an emphasis on perfection, such a denial of one's instincts, and the idea of the body as being made in the image of God. And then so I think that drives home this feeling of not only deep insecurity with one's body image and self-esteem, but I also think that it can lend to some of the, somewhat of the attention towards controlling the body, controlling and restricting it, or trying to somehow make it so that it is in the image and it's so perfect. And so, yes, I think I also, as I said starting out, I think people who are choosing to leave the church also find themselves kind of in this transitional phase, which is deeply distressing. And that, of course, I think also can make them at risk for developing an eating disorder if they've had one before, or if, of course, like some, and with if disorder eating has already just kind of been embedded into how you've experienced life itself, which is, the Mormon church, that yes, you fast but yes, and then again, there's always food at every function. And so I think that it can just kind of generate this distrust around, can I have food, and am I allowed certain foods? And if I do, am I a good person? And I think it can really make recovery hard, because it will be seen, even though, there's the logic of like, this is, I've left the church, but there's still deeply those internalized messages around gluttony. And so I think that can really kind of make recovery really, really challenging.
Sure. Okay. All right. So I'd like to spend the rest of our time that we have together kind of focusing on, first religious trauma, and then secondly, maybe sexual trauma. And you've kind of hit on some, themes already, but maybe we can do a deeper dive in the religious sphere. I mean, it's really interesting as you talk about Western Christianity, and that for hundreds, if not a few thousand years, even the idea of being, how you can be most spiritually connected is to be also most disconnected to your body. You kind of were talking about that, which is so fascinating, right? That this is kind of the one of the main themes that came out of this Christian thing. And so you can see people self-flagellating, right? Or you can see people fasting, or you can see people not getting married, expected to be celibate, and so it's like this idea that your body is at war with your God, and that somehow your body gets translated as a vessel for Satan to tempt, right? Or for the world to tempt, and all the appetites, whether it's food or sex or pleasure, even just resting, can be seen as like, oh no, we can't do that. And why we are so pleasure starved. It's just so fascinating to me, especially as a sex therapist, how people cannot relax into their sex lives. It's, they're kind of got a clock on, oh, we've been at this for 30 minutes. I've got other things to do, or I've got to get to sleep because I've got to get up at 5 a.m., to do the workout. And so they can't even really just make space for sexual arousal and pleasure, and forget sex for a minute. They can't even do that to take a nap or to lay in the sun for a second. It's like we're always on that clock of productivity. So yeah, I think this is a huge foundational piece of why I think sometimes people think religious trauma is just for those who've been maybe abused by an ecclesiastical leader or, something really big. But I think a lot of these messages are just downloading kind of a traumatic response over time, which is more of a complex trauma type of space. So I'd love to hear you think about or talk about how religious trauma in particular, with this emphasis of how then that affects our relationship with food.
Yes. Well, I mean, religious trauma impacts what doesn't it impact? It feels like sometimes, but in like considering the ways that, yes, it's like this massive severing from the body and the body's intuition, and it makes it really hard to trust those intuitions even after, choosing to leave the church. And I also think that that religion itself can distort reality, and so it can kind of, and it can really distort the sense of one's agency. And so when you think about like an eating disorder, what it does is it kind of offers structure, and it offers purpose, and it offers rules. And when you have chosen to leave a high demand religion, some of that rigidity feels really needed, and it can feel like having self-imposed dietary restrictions, or it's purging behaviors. Like, this is somehow you seek, like, you're really asserting control over your life. And I want to just like also say that, like, I also see this as a response to very oppressive beliefs and expectations that have been imposed onto individuals by religion. And I also I think of eating disorders as super multifaceted. They can include anxieties related to purity. They can include anxieties related to gender obedience, thinness, control. And they can also emerge as these very, very desperate attempts to kind of rectify this perceived immorality or inadequacy that of the body and the body's needs within a religious context. And so I do see how these things remain very intertwined. And then if we want to kind of throw in our relationships from food and our bodies and how that impacts our sexuality, is that, eating and sex, both are a human drive, a need, a function. Both food and sex come from the hypothalamus. They're coming from the same brain region, and they're both focused on the body, and they're both focused. Hunger cues and arousal come from the same place, and so that brain region is it's responsible for regulating our hunger cues, and it's controlling our basic physiological arousal. Well, when you're growing up in a religious context where there's good food, there's bad foods, there's good bodies, there's bad bodies, and your body needs to be perfect. It needs to be this vessel, and it needs to be a temple. Those types of messagings can start to really just completely make this part of our brain that's natural and it's regulating and its whole purpose is for homeostasis. It can hijack that. And so I do see this connection, and I still see this connection between how eating disorders, religious trauma also impact relationships and intimacy, because eating disorders are rarely about food, and sexual issues are rarely about sex. And so there's that component, but then there's also the component of pleasure and self-worth. And oftentimes people who have an eating disorder, also those who are in a high demand religion, they do not feel that they're deserving of pleasure. And so that self-denial and the denial of pleasure, I think, can be both stemming from religious trauma, and also can be reinforced when leaving a religious trauma environment, a high demand religion, because you're really just trying to create a sense of stability again. But there's also just all wrapped around that is that, like, I don't deserve pleasure. I don't even know what my pleasure is, but I know I don't deserve it. I'm so unworthy of it,
And even I do think there's the deserving part of it, and also there's the which maybe can be framed as deserving, but almost like it's not deserving of me. Like, pleasure is so sinful and so hedonistic and so downloaded in the sense of, like, that's where temptation will take me. that so there's one thing of like being like, oh, I don't deserve pleasure, but there's a whole nother kind of like almost pietist, like pleasure does not deserve me, I'm above pleasure, right? So it's a bit of a different energy. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, it does make sense. I think, I think that there's the roots of that really being kind of underlying like the idea of like holy anorexia, this like idea of I deny, and I'm exalted, and I'm exalted. And I think that those are really hard. That's super difficult to kind of release yourself from when it has been so intertwined with this idea around religious practice itself, religious fervor, and how there's always this complex interplay between denial as seen as a virtue, and that engagement with the body and with desire is seen as the ultimate first sin. A woman ate an apple. It's a sin, right? She desired the apple, she ate the apple. And that appetite itself is seen as the original sin. And so I think that also is underlying so much of how, of course, like an eating disorder could be a response to that. And I also think that eating disorders, for me, have an echo of protest and survivorship. I always really want to understand it from the lens that, like, this is a trauma response, and this is someone's way of trying to survive, and especially here, trying to survive a really oppressive environment and an oppressive set of rules. And so, eating disorders are, again, they're not about food. They're not always, the food is there, body image is there, but they're also this complex manifestation of bodily protest and survivorship. And so there's the cyclical pattern of, say it's with binge eating, of engorging, numbing, unburdening, and followed by, punishment. Very much connected to, how, we must repent for their sins. So I must engage in compensatory behaviors, be it, self-induced vomiting or over exercising or fasting for 3 days because I did this horrible thing. Or I also see, if we're looking at it from restriction, that is such a state of emotional numbing to something that feels very distressing, and how the ways that constriction itself can also serve this purpose of not having to necessarily feel, and it also shuts down that pleasure center of our brain. So it will completely take over the reward center that cues us into even having pleasure. And so you see the ways that the greater the restriction, the greater loss of enjoyment, sexual enjoyment, life enjoyment, pleasure, because it essentially what you're doing when you're restricting is that you experience hypogonadism, which is just the complete loss of pleasure, loss of libido. And so for me, I also see that as an act of resistance. If we say, like, you have never been able to exert your full agency or even your full sexual agency, when your capacity to have autonomy has been so thwarted, and desires, if you express them, are dismissed or ignored, restricting behavior lowers your pleasures, it lowers your desires, it lowers your sex drive. And so it can actually be seen as, again, like boundary setting. I'm putting in a boundary. I'm trying to resist how these things have been so made to feel that I should feel bad about them. Then if I can just numb that part of my brain, if I can just, completely tap off that way, then in so many ways, I don't also have to contend with the anxiety that I have a body that has desires and needs and wants, and I don't have to engage with it in that way. And so I also think that this is a form of survivorship, especially in a religious context where, the body and all of its wants and needs are seen as so entirely incongruent to God's work and God's plan. So yes, again, I think that that's all interwoven.
Yeah, that's really so interesting because, well, first of all, I love the reframe of this being a trauma response, instead of like this disorder per se. And that even when we're acting in ways that we might consider maladaptive, there's something adaptive about what we're doing, even if it doesn't currently make sense. But there is something about that. And then I really also think that this is such an important thing to talk about. And I see this with lots of kind of mental health issues, is that in these high demand spaces, we are actually rewarding what we as psychotherapists would say is maladaptive behavior, right? So for example, somebody is showing up with extreme anxiety and is showing up in a very scrupulous way. Scrupulosity is a form of OCD. I see a lot of those people get promoted within our religious community, because even though we would say, oh, it's not super healthy for you to be reading scriptures 3 hours a day, or to, have read, the Book of Mormon 20 times this year, that kind of stuff is like, wow, you are super pious. You're super worthy. Now you're a Superman or Superwoman in regards to your religious ways, instead of going, there might be something a little wonky about this, and maybe we should get this person some help. It's like, no, let's make you feel even more special and promote you. And so a lot of what you're saying, as far as if a female is having as one of the symptoms of an eating disorder is lower drive, lower appetites, that gets promoted. Not necessarily if she's married, but even if she's married, there's still something righteous and worthy of not caring about sex so much. And in fact, if she's partnered with somebody who is higher drive, it's like, well, you're the problem because you shouldn't care about this appetite as much as you do. And I'm the more pious one because it doesn't matter to me as much, right? So there's this, I guess what point am I trying to make? How religions, high demand religions, can oftentimes promote and put on a pedestal what we might consider maladaptive behaviors.
Yes. And I think sexual behaviors, just even thinking about this in terms of if you're partnered or not. And yes, the scrupulosity, very rewarded. Perfectionism, very rewarded. And yes, you're seeing these, you're seeing individuals who are, being promoted and moved through the church into higher leadership positions. And if we're also, attaching the ways that one of the things that high demand religion does do to people is it's emotional constraint. Certain emotions are certainly seen as bad, sinful, laughing, anger. Well, if you are a person, if you're especially a woman, and it would be so inappropriate for you to express anger. Well, if you are, if you're in a restrictive place, you're moving into malnutrition. And malnutrition, the psychological manifestations of it are reduced cognitive abilities, but also increased intrusive thinking, which again goes hand in hand with scrupulosity. And you also have impaired emotions, you're just somewhat dampened, you're toned down, and you're also having if you're dysregulating your hunger and thirst cues, well, of course, that's also going to show up in how you can have your sexual behaviors. And I do love how you've pointed out that yes, if you're with someone and it's mismatched libido and your libido has gone into, hypogonadism and you don't even have a sex drive, well, then you can say to the other person, you are the problem. your sexual appetite and impulses is the problem. And that's why I think we do see so many men showing up into our, especially into our spaces where it's like, I have a porn addiction, and I have, there's this way in which, like, yeah, we still have sexual needs. They're going to go somewhere. They're going to go to some place. And I also see how I always, with people who are partnered, if there is one person who has an eating disorder, and most studies show that adults with eating disorders actually do have sustained committed relationships comparable to those of individuals without an eating disorder. But in these relationships, an eating disorder can feel like an affair. It involves secrecy, it involves shame, it hinders communication, it can really impact the relationship because a person's can have diminished self-esteem, they won't feel comfortable in their bodies, they may feel inadequate, they will not even want to have sex, and the person with the eating disorder or their partner may even seek validation beyond that relationship. And so there's a loss of love and affection and that lack of time together because there's a preoccupation with food and body image, the potential of withdrawing from your partner. And this can lead to a perceived or actual loss of affection in the relationship. So the person without an eating disorder may develop resentment and may not feel like they're a priority, and this can create feelings of neglect, and this may even lead to infidelity, or it may lead to seeking sources such as pornography to satisfy that need. And so I don't, even if you can make it out, there's still implications afterwards where, an eating disorder can be, again, even in relationships where maybe there hasn't been or isn't any sexual agency, an eating disorder can actually be that form of resistance of like, well, I just don't feel in the mood. I truly don't have it in me today. And so, but I also see how this creates such relationship discord and how that needs attention as well.
Yeah, right. And I don't want to go into this too much because this is a whole 3-hour conversation of itself, but I do want to clarify, because I don't think you're saying this, but I want to be careful on how people are hearing it, that even when there is infidelity or betrayal, even if there are systemic reasons that we both need to take into account as far as how we're participating, we're not necessarily saying, well, now it's the eating disorder person's fault that their partner had an affair, right? And I know you're not saying that, but I just want to be very clear. But usually when there is any form of infidelity, that's part of the hard work is, first of all, holding the person who stepped out accountable, but then also holding the relationship accountable of maybe, are there aspects of how we got here together? And that can feel really victim blamey, right? For the person who didn't necessarily do the betrayal, but there are relational aspects of this. That's a very tricky thing that we could have a whole nother podcast on. Yeah, a lot of what you're saying, I think, can go either way. Anytime you have an issue, it's very easy, depending on the context of that relationship, for one partner to take the blame, right? So I could see, for example, a person, like a couple coming in and the person who does not have the eating disorder saying, you're the problem, right? Your eating disorder is the problem. It's interfering with our life. It's interfering with our sex. You go fix yourself. And it also, depending on the context, there could be a person who's like, no, you're the problem because I'm meeting my goals and I'm not gluttonous and I don't have all these appetites, and you need to figure out why all those things are so important to you. And I'm usually like, okay, can we just first of all say we are an entity, and whatever issues one of us has, it's going to affect the other. And maybe we should have some conversations and some couples counseling around how we both participate in these patterns that then can lead to some of the results that you're talking about. Anything you want to say before I move into sex as far as what I just said?
No. I'm glad that you clarified. I'm not trying to hold the eating disorder as the source for infidelity. But I will say that even if you use it as in a metaphorical context, it can feel like there's another entity in the relationship.
Absolutely.
This level of secrecy and shame, and it can feel for the partner who does not have an eating disorder. there can be an expressed feeling of helplessness and fear, concerns around, both the physical and mental well-being of the person they love. And also there's just not a lot of awareness of how to love someone through an eating disorder. I think that a lot of people take this, you just need to eat a hamburger, or they take a tough love. And I think that can drive the eating disorder even further into itself, because a person is feeling so invalidated. And so I think what is really important, at least for our work, is just really knowing roles and being able to support both partners, because it can be such a disruption to the relationship. And so having information, yes, but also how, if you go even deeper underneath it, it's like, well, just like, how there's always so much underneath infidelity itself, and so much of it usually is an unmet need. Well, this is that deeper exploration around, like, what is the eating disorder telling me? What is it wanting from me? What is feeling like it's not being met or cared for? Or where am I feeling that I am not so securely attached that I'm needing this pseudo attachment figure of my eating disorder to regulate me, to care for me, to comfort me? And so I do think that just trying to explore underneath it is also really important for both partners, because oftentimes there's things not being said that need to be moved up and out, so that both individuals can feel reconnected. And this just becomes a little more tricky because we also need someone to become reconnected to their body. And so it really is kind of this invitation, though, for everyone to kind of explore deeper underneath. What do I want here? What is this needing from me?
I love it. Yeah, thank you. So with the last few minutes that we have, I think most people could kind of understand if you've been physically sexually assaulted, right? And somewhere in your life, an unwanted sexual encounter of any sort. I think most people could understand, okay, that starts leaving people with this sense of a violation. I didn't have control over my body. And we know that eating disorders are oftentimes about regaining control. So that could make sense, right? That, oh yeah, if you had some type of physical sexual assault, that could lead to this complication of using food as a way to get back control over your body. I think what we talk less about, and maybe what I would like to focus on, although by all means, if you have anything you want to say about physical sexual assault and the intersection with eating disorders, I want to hear it. But the psychological sexual assault of purity culture, which we've kind of already been talking about, but more around, restriction and not so much about sex itself. And so I'm really trying to put out the message that even if you've never been physically sexually assaulted, if you've been raised in a high demand purity culture environment, there is a psychological sexual assault there, which I think we've been addressing throughout this whole time, to the point that you're not really even allowed to touch your own body in a way that feels yummy and erotic. We call this masturbation, and even that term feels very baggaged. It's a term I try to say it as much as possible because that's how we reclaim words, but it also can feel dirty or sinful, or just the word itself can bring up a lot of activation in folks. So if we grow up in a space where even the touching of our own body is seen as to the point that it really, unfortunately in LDS culture, we have this, the sin next to murder is oftentimes how we talk about sexual sin without spectruming it at all, right? It's just like, what are we talking about? Sexual sin next to murder. The only thing I can think of that would be a sexual sin next to murder would be rape, incest, sexual assault, sexual trafficking. I think, yeah, sure, those sins, if we want to call them sins or just, criminal behavior, whatever you want to call it, would be impactful on people's lives almost to the point of murder, right? But yet the download that we get, especially as young teens and young children who are listening to these messages, is that, ooh, sexual sin. Well, what what sexual context do I have as a 13-year-old? I'm touching my own body. I'm looking at pornography, right? Or I felt up somebody's boobies, or I, handled his penis, or now I have sin next to murder. And this is getting downloaded in a way that I think causes severe psychological distress. And I don't think the mental health community is talking about this, because we all want to be very, honoring of people's religious beliefs, which I do as well. And yet when religious beliefs are harmful, it's just like families. I want to be supportive of families, but when your parenting dynamics are harmful to your children, I feel like we have a responsibility to start talking about this. So that's kind of where I'd like for you to go next, is how do you see this psychological sexual assault? If you want to talk about physical, that's fine too. But how is that interacting with something like an eating disorder?
This is such an interesting place to explore. Also, in part because when I think about high demand religion, one of the things that happens is not only is touching yourself akin to murder, your body is seen as such an inconvenience because it has desires, and those are so deeply unwanted that they become denied. But I also think, like, even considering sexual development itself, just the physiological components of it, and one of the things that high demand religion typically does have is modesty. And that's very rooted into the purity culture itself, but there's also very delineated gendered spaces. And so as soon as you start going through adolescence and sexual development, you're segregated, you're put into these sex segregated spaces. And so I also think about, like, how does this impact those whom don't feel their gender to be, like, their sex to be their gender, right? And that they're being thrust into these environments where, you're boys only, girls only. There's just these two genders, and you're in these spaces. And so I think that complicates it, in that, like, gender dysphoria and eating disorders. There's been a lot of literature here because there's a pretty good connection between bodily dissatisfaction and gender dysphoria, but it's a little bit different here in that eating disorders, the body dissatisfaction is really rooted in kind of like a fear of weight gain or unhappiness with body size or composition, whereas with, gender dysphoria, it's really bodily dissatisfaction with secondary sex characteristics that just don't align with that gender identity. So I'm seeing this distress here where there's this gender incongruence, and you're also being put into this very sex segregated space, and you receive very specific types of, rules that are different depending on the gender, and you're getting different responsibilities. And so again, like, this desire to be in the body that looks like yours may manifest itself as restriction to change into a more feminine composition, to, not have the development of breasts, to try to starve off having, menstruation, or trying to conversely try to gain a more masculine body shape. But, and so there's that component. But then I just think about how purity culture itself and this, like, endless denial around your bodily needs is one, and how that just becomes laid in with modesty practices, where it's, as your body is changing shape, I see the ways that suddenly things beyond your control become your responsibility to monitor that of others. So, I recently was, with a client who was telling me about how awful it was to start developing breasts, because then it became this thing that will make older men and boy, and like everyone is staring, and yet it's this thing that you can't control from developing unless you restrict. But also there's these markers on the body become a source of additional scrutiny and additional shame, and that you must be modest because you must control the behaviors of those who might see you as sexy, desirable, and how that starts to show up in how, oh, I can't even see myself that way. If I'm not allowed to look that way, then I can't see myself as someone who is sexy and desirous. And that just continues on through adulthood. And it's really, really hard when your body has become forbidden. It's really hard to suddenly say, like, oh, I want to have a relationship to you. This albatross I've just carried around and have been told is all things bad. Like now I want to know you, but how do I start? Where do I start? And so I think, yeah, I do see this way that religion also curtails sexual development. You're not allowed to have certain experiences because it's like the person writing me before their mission, like this very normal sort of experience when you're 16 years old is now become this huge open wound of God won't love me. I can't be loved. And so again, it's like I see the ways that like there's such a disruption to sexual development, and there's such distrust around your body and such distrust around your instincts and your bodily cues that an eating disorder can certainly manifest in this space, because it's going to help curb those desires. It's going to depending on the different way that the eating disorder might manifest. If it's binge eating, well, then that's a space where you get to lose control in the binge, where you're always feeling controlled and always controlling yourself and your body. Well, this is a space where you get to lose that control, but it's followed by punishment and it's followed by shame. Or if you're restricting, well, then you're restricting, and suddenly it can get interwoven with, well, now I don't feel any sexual impulses. I'm denying my body those sexual impulses, and that just gets hijacked. And it's really hard to get your hypothalamus back working. It takes a long time for weight restoration to take place. And in the interim time, it's really disruptive to not only the connection to your body, but your connection to other people. And so, I see the ways that like this is an extreme violation for people who are really being brought into and raised in high demand religion, and how it does just completely disenfranchise them from the experience of full body autonomy. And I always will see an eating disorder in that context as, this is me doing what I can to exert some level of agency over this body I am in. But my hope is, recognizing that, finding the space for what I also can see happen when people leave a high demand religion, which is that there is this feeling of rage, and it's so appropriate. A sense of violation should accompany a deep sense of rage. And I see that rage as itself very, very sacred. And I see it as vital. And I see it as something that can move. It can move. And so, especially when you've been denied the ability to ever express anger or, emotions that are seen as disruptive, I see that as also like can be very restorative. So yeah.
Yeah, that's it. You've given us a lot to think about. I love how your language, has even shifted some of my perspectives, because I don't always use the language other people use. And I love that because it makes me think about it differently. I think not to put you on the spot, but I think I'd love to have you back for episode 2 of this, because we've talked a lot about like the issues and why these things, tend to land the way they do. But I would like to also talk about like, well, so then what do we do about it, right? What are some of the things? And we've run out of time for today. So maybe I can convince you to come back and do part 2 in the next few weeks or months.
I would love a part 2. I have found this to be such an enjoyable experience. I knew sharing space with you on this topic would be, but I would love to continue the conversation, because I feel like we're just leaving it with, all these things happened and now, well,
yeah, good luck. Good luck. But this is step 1, though. I mean, self-awareness, being aware of like, I think just listening to somebody like you kind of put into words what that experience could have been about can be the first part of a healing journey. So I think this is super important that we spend time on this. But yes, I would like to move into, okay, well then, if you're going to deconstruct all this stuff, what do we know can help you reconstruct a different type of relationship with all of these things, with your body, with how you integrate with food, how you integrate with sex, how you integrate with spirituality, right? Whether that's religious or not. But I also want folks to know that, so Tara works at Symmetry Counseling. She's an associate under my supervision, and also has done quite a bit of training in these arenas, and is doing training to become a sex therapist and all of those things. So if you have enjoyed listening to her, as I have, and want to work with her either as an individual, I know you will also work with couples, give Symmetry Counseling a call, because she has some openings and she's just amazing. So any last words from you as far as anything you either want to market for yourself or just last thoughts from today's episode?
Well, one of the things that I will mention is that I am completing my inclusive eating disorder certification. And so I mention this just because I think that there's a lot of conversation, especially in the eating disorder world, for those who are who are clinicians around, health at every size. And while I definitely do believe that there is health at every size, I also approach everything through the lens of what has informed me both as a clinician and as a person. And so I am a social justice and a disability justice advocate and activist. And so I can sometimes press against the health at every size, because health by what standards, whose standards, right? And so but I as a clinician, my goal is to always have a very weight neutral space and a very inclusive space. And I do say this because I think that we also fail to recognize that eating disorders do show up and are actually more prevalent in bodies of size. And they often are denied care because they don't fit the criteria of what we culturally think of as an eating disorder. And so I really do encourage anyone who is experiencing any disconnection with their body, or having a very difficult relationship with food, or feeling inundated by wellness culture and the proliferation of all the things we need to be doing just to essentially leave our house, and to really consider reaching out. I'd love to work with you, but also I've just so enjoyed this time with you, Natasha, and I can't wait to just continue our conversation. And I thank you for having me on.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing so many wonderful tidbits of wisdom with us. So I hope you've enjoyed this interview. If you have questions or thoughts, by all means, reach out, especially if you want to, tune into Tara again. What kinds of questions would you want us to have her answer in episode 2? So have a great rest of your weekend, Tara. And this was lovely. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now say the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Nahotishki the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Now Dishki say the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.